I also see some of my colleagues trickling in. So how about I get started by introducing us on the GGV and on who's here. So most of you know me already. I'm Robin. I'm on the investment team at GGV. And then we have Dave Raymond here. So Raymond, would you like to just give a brief intro about you? I know most people have interacted with you over email as well.
Yeah, sure, Robin, thanks. So I'm Raymond. I've been with GGV for 8 years or so, and I lead our data analytics team. So primarily, we kind of handle portfolio management. We work with all of our portfolio's data as well as our fund data, and we try to generate insights to help our management make decisions. Very nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Dave, would you like to also give a brief intro?
Hi, I'm Dave Granitz. I lead IT globally at GGV. We have 5 offices around the world right now, and so interesting challenges dealing with IT vendors and different geos, and it's always interesting, exciting things happening.
And negotiating contracts all the time.
Oh, for sure. It's a fun ride for sure.
We also have Marcello here, who I know a lot of you work with. So Marcello, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. Nice to see everyone. I'm on the investment team working with Hans and Robin. And nice to see you, David. Thanks for coming on and chatting with us.
Okay, great. So let's kind of get started on why we are here. So the reason why we wanted to pull this together was because, one, we've been seeing a lot of this pain point within GGV in terms of figuring out what to do with our own finances and expenses and tech stack. But more importantly, this became a topic of discussion in the boards, or at least a lot of the boards that I'm in, on like, what do we do in a recession? And also, how do we best prepare for it? And in addition, what do we do in terms of honing in our OpEx? There's one way where like a lot of us are cutting people, which can be very detrimental to a company in the long run. But there's also other ways that we can optimize our spend. And one finding that I came across here was that Tropic is a company that actually 4 of our portfolio are using, and I just kind of came to know about it, especially because Keegan, who is here, is one of my good friends who I met through Chief. So that kind of brings in like having a speaker here, and that's why David from Tropic is here today. Just so you guys know, in terms of like the format, if everyone who is here, I know many of you have already put your company names next to your title here, but if you could do that, I think it will make the discussion a lot easier so people know who you are. And then second, this is going to be a very interactive roundtable. I want to have people be able to chat, ask questions. So always feel free to just type the question directly into the chat, and we will also make sure to answer along the way. And yeah, David, I guess we'll kick it off to you.
Awesome. Robin, thanks so much for inviting me out. Everybody else, it's really great to meet and see you. As Robin said, would love for this to be interactive. So by all means, hit the chat. If you have very specific tactical questions that perhaps because of our perspective at Tropic I can be helpful on, I'd love to get into those. I think it would be great for today's discussion not to be another really high concept of like, we need to cut spend, but how are we actually going to do that? What does that mean now and in the future? So without further ado, I'm David Campbell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Tropic. We call what we do purchasing infrastructure. I was a VP of sales at a company called Wunderkind. After that, I was a global business manager at Microsoft. And I just had a baby 8 weeks ago, and I find every opportunity to work that into my conversation. So shameless plug on the family there. I'm going to do a very quick breeze through what we do at Tropic. I don't want this to be a Tropic sales pitch, but I do want to provide some context on what we do, so you have a sense for the perspective that it affords us in the space. So Robin touched on tech stack as a commodity where there's an opportunity to optimize spend. A lot of you some version of this slide at some point in time, I'm sure. Mark Andreessen famously said software is eating the world. Fast forward to this year, and there's more, we're drowning in software. There's more than 10,000 different software point solutions. And very importantly, for the customers that we work with and the customers that we talk to, software has risen the ranks and tends to be the #2 line item in terms of overall cost after people at technology companies. And that's a relatively new concept, right? And that's really what we're reacting to at Tropic. You can see a stat across the top of the slide. This was pulled from a study HubSpot did with a handful of spend management platforms, determining that the difference between, I think it was 2019 and 2021, is 50% higher expenditure on cloud software. We don't see that trend going anywhere, but software is a tricky commodity to manage, right? Price transparency is hard to come by. Quality is hard to know about. It's difficult to see behind the curtain in SaaS and to manage SaaS in a way that you would manage other commodities, such that there's dramatic variations in purported list price or even discounted price versus actual should cost of these different tools that companies are using. And these are actual deviations from proposed discounts that we've seen in terms of what you're actually paying versus what the vendor is telling you that they should. So software is not alone in this, but it's a category that's notorious because it's now such a high impact cost item. The other thing about software is it's really hard to buy. And we're going to talk more about this later on as we talk about, what can we do literally right now to cut costs versus if we're moving into a 3-year recession, how do we actually set up our companies infrastructurally to support purchasing on an ongoing basis so that we're buying software intelligently for the next 2 to 3 years versus just hacking everything that we can today. And then the last thing that I'll say about software is that it's also tricky because it's not like buying widgets that you're using to build a physical car, in that cost savings are not the only thing that matters, right? You could have, and I'm sure many of you do, very innocent seeming software purchases that start below $10,000, Datadog, Amplitude, whatever those platforms are, engineering tools that don't get negotiated, don't get risk mitigation built into the contracts, don't get future proofing added to them. And 2 years later, as the utilization of your platform grows, the cost of that technology grows linearly with it. And all these other things that you can see below the tip of the iceberg are relevant when you think about how to buy and manage software effectively. So this is essentially what we do at Tropic. We have data points on thousands and thousands of providers from working with hundreds of companies to help them buy all of the tools that they're using. We help automate the workflow surrounding that so you can implement process. And we have a team of tier 1 procurement resources who actually manage the negotiation and renewal process on your behalf. This is why I think it matters though. So by the numbers, this means that in our database, we have more than once negotiated with well over 2,000 providers. At least once we've seen significantly more than even that. We've executed over 9,000 negotiations on behalf of customers. Our average savings or cost avoidance are upwards of 20%, which sounds impressive, but we find that the majority of companies have about 30% overspend in software for a variety of reasons. One being, overlap, different teams buying different tools to do the same thing, or different teams buying the same tool, but not contract, underutilization, and good old fashioned overpricing. We're managing significantly higher than $500 million in spend, but have negotiated that amount on behalf of customers and saved a lot of time in the process. And this is kind of what we're pulling from because we sit at the nexus of a lot of different transactions in software. We have a lot of insight into what other companies are doing and also kind of what the provider side of the ecosystem is doing as we've seen, the official bear market begin and the movement into the recession economy. So let's shift into navigating a downturn. I don't think we need to belabor the point. I'm sure everyone on this call has already seen all the headlines. Sequoia put out a good deck. If you haven't seen that one, the guys at, David Sachs, Craft Ventures, they put out, published a YouTube video that they gave to their portfolio companies talking about how to think about metrics and how to think about fundraising in a down market. So there's great information out there. I'm not going to regurgitate any of that since you can find those resources on your own. Again, kind of wanted today to be, really tactically about what can we do right now and how can we get set up for the future. So here's some, high-level data that we've observed, and this has been collected just over the last few weeks across the customers that we work with. And I also, as I mentioned, I had a kid. When I came back from paternity leave, it was a fundamentally different market than the one that was there when I went away on paternity leave, which obviously has me as a CEO asking lots of questions and, scrutinizing the business very closely myself. One of the things that I did is I went on a listening tour and I talked to lots of other CEOs in my network beyond just our customer base. And I kind of recorded how they're approaching, spend behaviors with the market changing. Because for us, there's obvious implications on our go-to-market strategy and our product. And what we've seen is that 10% of companies are in full budget freeze, full stop for the foreseeable future. Nothing gets through. 30% of customers are eliminating all growth at the renewal and pursuing the goals that are trickling down from the finance leadership are no contracts should be higher than they were last year, come hell or high water. Tricky with contracts like NetSuite because they're going to make you do their 5% or whatever it is every year anyway, but lots of downward pressure on those contracts. And certainly no commitment to growth in the renewal, which, as we all know in the past, and in a growth at all costs economy, is a really meaningful lever that you can pull to influence the unit cost. Companies are not doing that right now. We also have seen that there's been a really meaningful reduction in the willingness to sign a multi-year contract, down 77%. And what's interesting is that for customers that we've spoken with, they're actually in many cases okay with this being at the expense of the unit cost in their contract, because they're looking for any way out of that contract, even if it means, signing another year with a vendor rather than committing for multiple years and saving more money. And then kind of the no-brainer stuff after that, 100% of companies are focused on more favorable payment terms. This, by the way, is an area that we have seen a fair amount of flexibility in the vendor ecosystem. Maybe you can't negotiate a lower rate on a flat renewal with the vendor that you've been working with, but many vendors, particularly not your megalithic vendors, but your Series B, Series C type vendors, are a little more willing to become flexible on payment terms at this moment, given what's happening in the market. And 100% of companies that we've spoken to are focused on rationalization, which can take a couple different flavors. And if you ask me, if a question is raised of what can I do right this minute, I don't want to buy Tropic, I don't want to invest anything into this, what can I actually go do? Rationalization is a great place to start, right? Let's get together all of the different expenditures on SaaS, including all the credit card stuff. Let's make a grid of this stuff and audit, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and figure out if there's anything that we're buying that has duplicative functionality. Because a big shift that we've seen, last thing I'll say on this slide, a big shift that we've seen in purchasing behaviors in general is that finance teams are really afforded significant empowerment now. Something that we saw, even just a couple months ago, I was talking to Robin about this when we spoke the other day, is that if you had, a VP of marketing, a VP of sales, whoever it was, with budget at a very high growth venture-backed technology company, if they wanted to buy something, there was little the finance team could do at most companies to stop them from buying that thing. If they said, hey, this is an ROI generating tool, I need to go buy it. I don't need to talk to anybody else. I already did my homework. This is the best possible tool in the world. And this is the best possible price. I'm going to go get it. Generally speaking, they would go get it. What we're seeing now is that those business stakeholders are ready for and more, I guess they're listening more to pushback that comes from the finance operations side of the house to say, hey, I get it, but right now we need to cut costs, and that's the order of the day. And we're focused on having better gross margin. We're focused on reducing our burn. Can this tool wait? And what we've seen is that empowerment now rests with the finance team to say, no, we're not going to buy that. So, think about that as you think about opportunities to rationalize. So this is just, high level kind of what we're seeing. Now, in terms of questions that you can ask that can prompt actions that you can take, I try to distill this into kind of the most basic first, set of steps that you can take as you start to think about optimizing your expenditure. The first one is, do I know everything I've bought? Which is not as simple a question as it often sounds, right? This means, auditing, looking at QuickBooks, looking at credit card statements. We've seen a lot of companies that aren't working with us will, send a questionnaire out to everybody on every team and say, tell us every tool that you're using so that you can get line of sight into all of the critical systems. You can also get line of sight into the tools that they didn't put on the sheet that you still see, someone's buying with a credit card somewhere, and you can literally just cut all of those, right? And then with what you have left, you can start to ask questions like, is this a need to have or is it a nice to have? And what we're seeing across the board is that nice to have is getting cut. And decisions about what is need to have truly, I think, are becoming a lot more rigorous than they were before. So audit is step one for a lot of these. The second is, am I using my tools wisely? Operative word here being wisely. So one of the things that I think is important to think about as you move into, the next couple years is that some vendors that you need something from right now are vendors that you're going to have to work with for the next few years. I think of like Salesforce, right? You can't go scorched earth in a negotiation with Salesforce because Salesforce is the only one that you're probably going to use for the next couple of years if you're deeply integrated with them. So how can you make sure that you're optimizing your usage of Salesforce? Good example of this is, I've seen a lot of companies that, I know this is kind of tactical, but I want to give everyone an example, is I've seen a lot of companies that are using something else for CPQ, using Salesforce for CRM. They know Salesforce has a CPQ product. It's not the best product on earth, but it satisfies the use case for CPQ. And they're cutting that other vendor and moving more into the Salesforce Enterprise Agreement. That's something that a couple months ago we would not have seen. I think that the usage and purchasing behaviors that we saw a couple months ago were very much around best of breed. Let me get the best possible tool for every use case. We're seeing a significant migration into enterprise contracts, which if you're an early stage startup, like, if we were still 50 people at Tropic and someone said, hey, the best thing for you is to go all in on a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, I would have said you're insane, right? We're going to use Slack, we're going to use Salesforce, we're going to use all these other things that are not Microsoft, but we are seeing consolidation into enterprise agreements today. So the third piece, those two are very related to impact right now. What can we cut right now comfortably without sacrificing mission critical utilization for the business and without souring a relationship with a strategic vendor that we're going to need to weather the storm for the next few years? The third is really about getting set up for the future, which is, do I have an adopted purchasing process? Which again is not as simple as it sounds. And for us, we always recommend implementing a purchasing portal so that you have some system of record. This, by the way, can be a Google form, right? It doesn't need to be a really sophisticated piece of technology, but getting really, really rigorous about driving compliance on, I don't care if it's a $3,000 whiteboarding tool. If you want to buy it, the first step is you go to this Google form and you answer the questionnaire and it starts a process on our side. So getting that compliance, getting your arms around it, that's going to be really key to prevent rogue purchasing going forward. The fourth one is really tricky. Are my prices fair? This is something that we can help with, but you can also, of course, consult your network. And knowing the benchmark is often not enough to get a better price, right? Like if you call Salesforce and say, hey, my buddy down the street is paying half this price for their Sales Cloud license, your Salesforce account rep will surely say, what do you want me to do about that, right? But it is really valuable so that you have confidence going into these negotiations, right? That's really where the benchmark piece comes in. If you know where the bottom is on a given vendor and you know the variation from that bottom in your current contract, then it'll give you the confidence to really push and ask and prod for those things that you need to get out of your relationships with vendors. And then the last one, which we already touched on, is, am I paying for duplicate tools? If so, let's just stop doing that and rationalize immediately. So, big takeaway from this slide, and then I'm going to stop talking and we can move into more of a general discussion. The big takeaway is audit the stack as soon as possible if you haven't already, and make sure that you have literally everything on the table, including those tiny credit card purchases that don't usually make the cut, because those are the ones that can be the highest risk over time. And once you have that picture, identify your duplicates and start to make some hard decisions. Like I mentioned Slack before, I talked about the empowerment that we've seen in the finance function. We've seen companies moving away from Slack and adopting Microsoft Teams, which I never in a million years would have thought would happen in the startup ecosystem because of the cost efficiency afforded by a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement. You can always go by Slack again later, but right now, if you need to cut something expensive, it might make sense to embrace the clunky enterprise option versus buying the best of breed. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. I think I'm going to kill my screen share for just a minute. I'd love to hear from you guys. Maybe this was remedial, maybe it was advanced, maybe you already knew this. In any case, we have a lot of intel here at Tropic. I'm a totally open book. If there's something specific that you're dealing with and something specific that you'd like weigh in on, I'm more than happy to kind of do my best to speak to those things now.
I guess I have a question. One of the things that we, and Dave, you could speak to this too, that we tried to implement was the, I think it was number 3 or number 4 on your list of having a purchasing request tool or portal. And it's really hard to get people to adopt that. And also in a timely manner, because we always see people come, either do it at the last minute or right when the contract is due. And so to renegotiate. And so like, what are some of the best practices you've seen for people to like, how far in advance before renewal date should you start actively thinking about this and actively consulting people on what
Yeah.
the best prices are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, totally, there's always an element of change management there. Like what contract owners and lines of business don't like is more process, right? And quite often they're used to, getting what they want when it comes to purchasing. So any element of process is going to introduce some friction. There's a couple of ways of mitigating that. To answer your question directly, the best way to do it is give yourself 90 days. In startup world, it's not going to happen. It just never does, right? Like you don't have 90 days for anything. So I would say at a minimum though, get 30 days and at an absolute minimum, get 2 weeks. One thing that you want to be really mindful of is the auto renew clause in your contracts. And one of the first things that you can do, like when you think about contract metadata, that's one of the first things that we like to look at and extract because it's all over the place. It could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, it could be before the day of the renewal. And you really want to know what you're working with because that date is the day at which you lose your leverage. Once you've already surpassed the auto renew date, it's understood for most vendors that you're going to be renewing at a minimum the cost that you were paying last year. So if you're trying to take out costs, you need to jump 30 to 90 days before that. So, this I think is a piece of low-hanging fruit that a lot of companies get wrong when they're first kind of establishing a purchasing process. They'll say, we need X days before the renewal date. You should shift that mindset to before the opt-out date. And the opt-out date should be the drop dead date that's governing all of your activity on a contract. Now, in terms of driving adoption, a couple things. The first thing is your process needs to be adoptable, right? And that's why I said, like, maybe it's a Google form. We offer workflow technology to do this and to automate this stuff. But like, if you're not ready for that, do a Google form. Don't boil the ocean or do something with too many steps because then it won't get done, right? And the easier it is, the less friction there is for the end user, the better. And there's going to be trial and error with kind of conditioning them to ask first. So we always provide kind of like, here's a snippet that you put in your Notion or your Guru, whatever it is that you're using for knowledge management. Here are the steps. Make sure that that's like a one-page thing that you can read from a phone, seriously. Like, because if it's too long and it's like, I got to go over here for $100,000 or more, and I go over here for, IT team, and I go over here for marketing team, then your stakeholders are going to get lost. And as soon as they encounter any friction, they're going to jump out of the process and do their own thing, right? So really like dumb it down to its barest bones, I think, for launch. And then, the other thing is, I think, as finance leaders, you have to be willing to really say no, right? And be willing to like demonstrate to a marketing leader, like, you brought this to me too late, therefore I can't authorize it, right? Like we can't right now with what's happening in the business and what's happening in the macro economy, love your team, love the idea, but we can't do it. We need more runway. And then I think once people encounter an actual no from the finance team and sort of get a feel for the fact that this can happen now in the new economy, they'll be more willing to adopt the process because otherwise they're not going to be able to get the tools that they want. So that's a political decision. Obviously, every company is different, but that's where we see the most success for what's going on right now. And then, the sooner the better, of course. Let's see, I had a question also from you, Robin. So what have you signed a multi-year contract? And what you're hoping to do is, so is this like a fair use case? You signed a 3-year contract with Salesforce. It has 50 seats. You just laid off 25 people from the team. So you now have a contract for seats that you're not using. Is that like the kind of scenario that you're describing? Cool. So we saw companies, including Salesforce, giving handouts and straight up saying, okay, we'll reduce your contract during COVID. And I think all of them learned their lesson and were unable to recoup some of that value post-COVID and are taking a much firmer position this time around. Now, what you can do though, and this is something that we have seen, we've seen it with Salesforce, we've seen it with Zendesk, we've seen it with a handful of larger providers, is they're accountable for a total contract value, right? Sometimes what they'll do is they'll let you get creative with the duration of the contract as long as you're retaining that total contract value. So this would only make sense if it's a strategic vendor that you don't plan to move away from. But we saw this with Zendesk, for instance, which you would think very rigid public company, probably not going to accommodate, well, public for now, probably not going to accommodate your needs. What they were actually willing to do in a couple of cases is extend the duration of the contract. So add 6 months, add 12 months, reduce the annual contract value such that you had kind of right-sized contract to seat ratio. but extend out the duration of the term. So they're saying, look, we're willing to take a hit in our annual contract value with you. We're not willing to take a hit in our total contract value. And it's giving them runway to kind of catch you back up to where you were by extending out the end of the term. So that's something that we've definitely seen. You will have a fair amount of vendors who will just say, you know what, contract's a contract, right? So that's going to happen as well. Dave G.
Hi. Hey, yeah, thanks. I appreciate a lot of the tips you shared. For example, the one around consolidating vendors. Like just as an example of that, if you're already a Zoom customer, Zoom gives deep discounts if you add on phone service, right? Consolidate your phone vendors.
Webinar, all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I think the thing that I struggle with the most, the thing that really takes a ton of time is sort of the first step of your pyramid there, which is tracking utilization, like which tools are really being used, which tools are loved by the users, where should we focus our budget dollars, our efforts. And I try to have all of our key vendors send us utilization stats on a regular basis, and I try to normalize them and put them into spreadsheets. It's a ton of work. Is there a better way to track which tools are being better used and loved by the users so we can sort of focus our dollars there?
Definitely, yeah. So there's a whole industry around SaaS management. There's point solutions that will do literally just that, including kind of sentiment analysis and stuff like that. Shameless plug for Tropic. That's one of the capabilities that we offer, but you don't have to do it with us. You can do it elsewhere. And so what most of those platforms are doing. Do you guys have a single sign-on provider that you're using?
We do, and at some level we've integrated that with our utilization tracking system, but I feel like those numbers are not accurate. Like, for example, we have a CRM and we have a knowledge system, and you don't need to log in through the single sign-on vendor every day to get into those. It just sort of remembers you. And so those numbers are just not really accurate, it feels like.
Yeah, there's definitely a margin for error there. And this is kind of in the weeds, and sorry if I'm boring everybody, but there's two paths when it comes to technology to manage this. There's direct integrations with the vendor, which are very solid and robust. And then there's single sign-on integrations where you're fetching logs from Okta or whatever it is, right? And all it's really telling you is this is the last time somebody logged in. You also have apps that don't require you to log in all the time, right? You stay logged in for months, potentially at a stretch, and that'll create some inconsistency there. I wouldn't, boil the ocean too much for the purposes of cost cutting. I think it's better to get a pulse from the user and just say, like, this is why I like thinking of the audit as a user-centric thing. Like, what are the tools that you're using every day that you need? Because what we find is when you start the audit there, you almost always are getting like 70-80% of the tools that you're actually buying. And then you could be like, oh, so nobody said that they need these 20% of things that are just like sitting on a credit card renewing every year. Let's get rid of that stuff immediately, right? So, there's technological ways of kind of hacking into the utilization, which we use to fuel our negotiation product. But there's also just the, getting a pull from the user groups, which I think is pretty illuminating too.
Yeah. So surveying, like checking in with the users on a regular basis, seeing what they love, what they're using, what they're not using.
Yeah, give them like a quarterly survey. Like I think when we did that internally before, we're building product for that we don't have yet. When we do it internally, we just use Google. Like I love G Suite. It's got like most of the stuff you need to like start tackling this stuff.
Great, thank you.
David, I know you have some case studies. Maybe we can go over some of those because I think those are super helpful.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So had a couple quotes here from customers that we're working with. Wanted to show you that we think that investing in procurement, whether you're doing it internally or you're doing it with a partner, is something that has a meaningful impact at every stage. So in the case of Clara, we signed them when they were around a 50-person company. The big focus at that point was, creating not only the money savings of implementing a procurement process, but also the money savings by way of the time savings, right? Uncoupling a CEO from like a $20,000 contract negotiation, somebody with really expensive time, uncoupling, your divisional leaders and your executive team from, a menial $5,000 renewal somewhere. To save money and save time and save more money by saving time from expensive salaried people. At the SMB level, implementing, and investing more in procurement is really about creating the core infrastructure of procurement, getting a process in place, getting a team in place, knowing that we now have adoption across our company when it comes to how we like to buy. And in the case of Daily Harvest, who we work with, they were able to reduce their SaaS expenses by 20%. SaaS being a really huge line item for them, that was a meaningful level of business impact. It's also valuable at the enterprise level. So if you have a procurement team, there's still tremendous value, we would say, in working with a third party of some kind, because a third party has the advantage of seeing Salesforce 200 to 300 times per year versus one time every 3 years, right? And the insights afforded by that and the data afforded by that can help inform business decisions. We've also done some good work with GGV portfolio companies. So we're working with Tala, we're working with Chief, we're working with Electric, we're working with Slice. In the case of Chief, I believe we saved them 27% on their Salesforce contract. It was something crazy that we were really pleased with, because that was their biggest contract, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. I may have to follow up with the right number and redact that one, but it was somewhere around there. Just started with Electric. We've been working with Slice for quite some time as well. We do have a public case study with Tala on our website. So if you want to read more about this principle and you want to see like what's possible from investing in procurement, which in a lot of cases, what we're doing is augmenting what the organization would do on its own anyway, right? So my hope is that you can gather some things from this talk that you can implement regardless of whether you work with somebody or not. But we were able to drive over $1 million of savings in year one for them, which was directly tied to a savings initiative they had at the time. They were kind of restructuring the business, saved about 30% on the biggest contract they have. It was Twilio, if I'm not mistaken. And the average savings overall was about 22%. As I said, there's usually about 30% room. It's usually impossible to collect all 30 though. There's going to be vendors that dig their heels in. There's going to be contract clauses that you can't overcome. So if you're thinking, you know, one of the questions that I've been asked a lot recently is like, what is the impact that I actually should be driving right now, right? Like someone yesterday was like, I need to save $650,000 full stop. Like, what can I get from SaaS? And I said, well, let's look at your SaaS footprint. My guess is that anywhere between 15 and 20% of that is money that you could be recouping with, you know, intelligent negotiations over the next year. So, and we have a lot more, you know, case studies that go into significantly more detail on our website if you want to dig into the stuff more. The bottom line though is there is always room in software. And like Robin said earlier, much better to cut software if you can. If it means that you don't have to cut people, it's much easier to recoup the losses, you know, you accrue by cutting software. If there's a hit in productivity or a hit in revenue or something like that because you lost a tool, it's easier to bring the tool back later than it is to go hire a new team, train them up, and, you know, get them to a full level of optimization. I see a couple. Oh, and while we're here, I'll just round out the last couple slides. So one thing that we're offering also for free to anybody that's on the call, we do, it's a part of our sales process, but you don't have to, there's no strings attached. Like you don't have to go through a whole process with us. If you want to just know how much room you have, we have a process where we can actually tell you that pretty quickly. And we'll provide a report that basically breaks down what all of the spend is, what the software category looks like, and what the savings potential is within the software category. You can reach out to Keegan, who's on our partnerships team. She's on the call here. Shoot her an email if you want to get a free savings estimate, and we'll break it down by category. So you'll know, you know, even if you're conducting your own negotiations and you're doing this process on your own, you'll have some confidence to know which of those categories have the most room and really where to spend your time. So wanted to throw that out there. It's free. If you guys want one, just reach out to Keegan and we can set you up. It takes like 2 days to turn around a report for you. So I'm going to stop sharing again and go back to the chat. I see we got a couple stuff in here. So from Guillermo, you mentioned companies are switching from Slack to Teams. Does that mean also switching other apps to the M365 suite? If that's the case, how do you suggest we go about the key questions when leaving individual products for bundled enterprise solutions? And how do we analyze if the switch was successful? Yeah, great question. So analyzing whether you know, all of it I think comes from like being really dialed into your user base, because usually the types of tools that you would migrate to an enterprise solution are going to be those like shared services, right? Operational tools, you know, that everyone is using. And, you know, like I said, if you told a company we're moving away from Slack, you know, a couple of months ago, it would have started a holy war against Microsoft because, you know, Microsoft Teams kind of sucks, right? It gets the job done, but it's not the best option. So, you know, I think it comes down to first really understanding the needs of your user group. And this, by the way, if you're dealing with a platform like Microsoft or like Salesforce, this is key anyway, because quite often the strategies of these businesses, like Microsoft, I know this because I was there, wants to get you on wall-to-wall enterprise M365 E5. and the sales rep gets paid a lot of money if you buy that. And you don't need that, almost definitely. Like maybe some of you do, but probably no one that I've ever seen actually needs that, right? And they want you on Dynamics and they want you using Azure. So they're going to heavily incentivize you to do all of those things and throw all these crazy discounts at you. What I find though is if you actually, this is hard work and not something that we actually fully support in Tropic. This would be like, something you'd have to be pretty hands-on with. But if you have a big install with one of those big players, you want to profile all of the user groups that are using it against a matrix of what capabilities they actually need. And what you'll find is you might have, say you're using Microsoft, I keep picking on them, same applies for anybody, Google is no different. You might have users that Microsoft is telling you are E5 users that are E1 users. And all they use, like you might have people that only use Excel, right? Like finance team just uses Excel. They don't, and they're Google everything else. You want to get to that level of sophistication when you're planning your Microsoft renewal, because even if they take all your discounts away, if you truly right size to the different capabilities that those different users are using, you wind up with a much smaller contract, right? So that also, to answer the originally asked question, will tell you if a switch is possible, right? Like, I think generally speaking, you may not have everything the way you want it in Teams, but it's more or less at parity with Slack at this point, right? And Microsoft has this tremendous, Microsoft like flipped a switch and took more market share than Slack overnight because Microsoft has all the giant companies, right? So in order for them to do that, they had to get to parity with Slack. They had to get to parity with Zoom, more or less. Like you might have a nice to have feature that you lose, but those, your users are not going to be thrilled, right? That's kind of the net of it. Like no one's going to be like, oh, thank God, we're all moving to Teams. But given the current climate, like they may be understanding, and that's why we're seeing it happen more often.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry for the Microsoft gobbledygook. I was only there for a year, and they still got deep in my brain with E5, E3, and all the things that they like to sell. Anybody else? Still got about 20 minutes left in the allocated time.
I got one quick thing. I felt like in March 2020, like all the vendors seemed to immediately know that they need to deep discount everything and like all hell's breaking loose. And I feel like, I've been in some contract renegotiations recently, some renewals recently, and it feels like they don't yet get that we're in just as bad, if not worse situation than we were in March 2020. Like, does it feel like those vendors are gonna figure that out soon? Like, why are the negotiations so hard right now? Why are they not, playing ball with us?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I think it's different this time. I think they're digging in their heels a little bit more. Salesforce is the one I pick on because Salesforce, when we were working on behalf of our customers at that point in time, like all we had to do was reach out, show proof that the business was impacted by COVID, and they would give us a discount, right? And I think that part of what was driving that is nobody knew where the bottom was with COVID, right? We're like, what, almost unprecedented global event. What's going to happen? Like, how impacted are the markets going to be? Is B2B SaaS going to bounce back? Is it going to be, a 10-year recession? Are we going to lose electricity on planet Earth, right? Like there were all those, we didn't know what was going on. I think this time around, they're a little savvier and, we do know where the bottom is. Like we've seen this before, and it's leading to much more rigid negotiations. I wouldn't say that they're not understanding. It's just the something for nothing that was happening during COVID has kind of gone away. Like it used to be enough to say like, look, we laid off half our team. Here's the evidence. Like you need to work with us. And it no longer is. That is true for the ones that know they got you, right? Salesforce knows they got you. Datadog knows they got you to a certain extent. Snowflake knows they got you to a certain extent. Marketing tools, sales tools, more commoditized offerings. You see a lot more flexibility there because they know that there are viable alternatives that have relatively low switching costs, right? So, but you can nickel and dime all of those, and that might be the bottom 10% of your spend, not going to move the needle necessarily the way it would if Salesforce would give you that 10% discount. So that's where you have to get creative with rationalization in particular, and potentially make some hard decisions around what tools are going to be available to which users. That's why I've kind of been beating on that drum.
Wait, sorry, one more thing, and adding to that, and Robin's earlier question around multi-year contracts, like, yeah. So I was in a renewal just recently where they said, hey, yeah, we have a standard, 5% increase, year over year, but if you do a 2 or 3 year contract, we'll waive the 5%. That it feels like that's not moving the needle for me. Like a 5% discount is not enough for me to do a 3 year commitment, right? Like what is the right like, okay, a 20% discount would be really interesting. Like 10% is on the border, but like a 3-year commitment feels risky in
Yeah.
this time.
So the standards that we've seen, which by the way are starting points in general, for most providers are 10% for a 2-year, 15% for a 3-year, and then you can kind of work from there. Notable exceptions, NetSuite, zero flexibility. Like NetSuite's crazy because you can get 80% off NetSuite the first time you deal with them, right? But once you're kind of locked into NetSuite, they're very, very rigid about collecting their uplift. In most cases, though, we've seen an ability to get the uplift waived, right? So just guys, we're not going to play that game. Like, we don't have budget for this. Like, don't make it complicated. Don't make us send this to RFP, right? We don't want to do that. You don't want us to do that. But we're not paying an extra 5% for nothing in a year when we're getting hammered, right? Like, we've seen that play out pretty successfully. But again, if it's a vendor that knows they have your business no matter what, it's a lot trickier. That's where you do have to get creative about extending the contract, and it's harder to kind of dig in on those discounts. Robin says, what is a good way to find out benchmarks on pricing? Seems like it can vary so much, and vendors tend to take advantage of smaller companies than large ones. Yeah, this is a industry-wide issue. It's crazy that, like, I can tell you from being behind the curtain, like, the volatility and what the same company will price the same product for a company the same size, it's like huge, like mind-blowing, right? And vendors obviously don't want you to have the transparency. So, the only way to really get there is with a network of peers that are buying the same thing. That's kind of, how we've built our data asset at Tropic, is by seeing hundreds of companies buy the same stuff over and over again. But you can get there, in Slack groups. Like, I've seen funds that will, the finance leaders within the portfolio companies will kind of band together and create like a network where they're willing to like share what they're paying for different things, so they can help kind of benchmark and get there. You can work with a third party.
That's a great idea. We actually do that for like venture debt. And so we have all the terms we collect for our like venture debt and all like the rates and stuff like that, and we share within our portfolio. So that could be something like we can find out for like the really big contracts or ones that matter.
Totally, relatively easy to set up and really high impact if you have it. And then, you could also, for the really big stuff, you could shell out the bread for Gartner, ISG, or somebody like that. They'll have really, really rich data on, Microsoft, Salesforce, Oracle, Google, that kind of stuff. We've built our business on this. This is, the data component of what we do. So we have access to that information, and we leverage it for driving outcomes for customers. So there's ways that you can kind of like jerry rig it. There's network, opportunities you can set up, and then, you could partner with somebody if you want to do that. Also, that's a great pro tip, Dave. Always sign up with larger vendors at the end of their fiscal year, at the end of their quarter. Definitely. And also, if you have a vendor that's really putting the screws to you and like really digging in, go totally silent until like the day before the renewal is due. And, I don't like to pull that one out if it's a vendor that we have a good working relationship with, but, if a vendor is disrespecting a buyer, just go radio silent. Because I know from experience at Microsoft, like, even if we got what we wanted, if we got it 2 days late, it was like, the end of the world. It was an apocalypse because the numbers had already been reported to the street and all that, right? So there is an element of kind of running the clock out if you feel like playing chicken, that can drive an impact sometimes.
Thank you.
Anybody else? What's top of mind?
I think we'll probably, like, if no one has any other questions, we will circulate kind of like the deck. I know some people pinged me last minute that they couldn't join, but we'll have like a kind of the recording we can share with everyone, as well as like the deck. And anything else, David, like, you think is relevant to the group, please let us know.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, and Keegan,
Yeah.
organizing.
My pleasure. So on that 5 action slide, all 5 of those actions could take a lot of different flavors, but that to me is the playbook. It's like, let's see what we got. Let's see what we can turn off right now. Let's kill the month-to-month stuff we don't need. Let's kill the stuff that we have overlapping. And then, let's remember that we have to stay frugal potentially for the next 2 to 3 years, and build a process, even if it's just a Google form, something that our end users will follow so that we can ensure that we don't wind up in a situation where we're overpaying for SaaS again. So I hope that was helpful. If not, and you have follow-up questions, you probably know where to reach me. If not, you can ping Keegan, she's in the deck. If any of you wants to take a look at one of those assessments, like I said, it's a quick 2-day turnaround for us, and we can, at least help you point in the right direction. And it was a real pleasure being here today with everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.